The member from Carver, Representative Nash.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, members. And Representative Sundin, I think this is a pretty decent bill, but I do think that there are some things that we need to address. And I serve on the Ways and Means Committee, and I remember that meeting where this came into the Ways and Means Committee, and I believe we spent just a really matter of minutes on it. I remember Representative O'Neill had a couple of questions about who was in the room, and I believe you were actually quite forward in the answer, and that was just a handful of people. And the reason I'm asking for this to be re-referred back to committee is for this reason. People in my district are asking, Jim, what's in the bill? How can I influence what's in the bill? Tell me more about what's in the bill. And for those of you that recognize that I am in the 7-county metro and you just think that I am a metro member, you've obviously never been to Carver County, you've never been to Waconia, you've never been to Norwood, you've never been to any of those places, because I have a very agrarian county, and I serve people who wake up at ridiculous hours in the morning and they go out and they make sure their cows are being milked, or they make sure that things are all well on the farm. And you know, one of the things that I think is interesting that you may not know is Carver County has 26 century farms, also known as centennial farms. That means that the land has been being farmed by one family for over 100 years. 26. I think that's pretty great. And I am a member of the Carver County Farm Bureau, and I meet with these folks regularly. And some of them are getting older. I think Representative Olson said the average age is 58. Well, in Carver County, that may be a little more. And many of the people who are on the farms have kids who they want to leave the farm to, and the kids don't necessarily want it. And I've heard this at Farm Bureau meetings, and we've had several people younger than Representative Olson say, you know, I'm not so sure. Mostly because, as he said earlier, the money's really not there. And if you look at what it takes to do a dairy farm, it's pretty rough. And I wish Representative Pearson was here, because he could tell you a little bit about growing up on a dairy farm. And for those of you that don't know this, every time he signs one of the many letters that we send out to constituents, he draws a little cow on there, just to show you how important that part of his history and part of his heritage and roots are. I watched him a couple times sign letters, and he'd very quickly draw the cow, and I asked him one time, and he told me the story about growing up on a dairy farm. But on the Carver County dairy farms, if you've watched the news lately, and for some of you, you may remember conversations that I've had here on the floor, in the last number of years, because the dairy industry is very, very tight, we've had a number of suicides. Let me say that again. We've had a number of dairy farmers make a horrible decision to say, I can't do this anymore, and the only solution that they found was to take their own life. It's tragic. It is tragic. So many of you are wondering, why are we fighting for this? Why are we fighting to make this bill go back to committee? What possible purpose would you have to stand here for hours and argue passionately to send a bill back to committee? And I'll tell you, it's for these 26 families that are century farmer families, and for the dozens of other people who are farming in Carver County and in all 87 counties where farms exist here in our great state of Minnesota. Because if we didn't cover this bill that detailed in Ways and Means, and we've heard from other members, Representative Nelson, he's somewhere around here, he may be sitting in an alcove, they didn't get a whole lot of input on the ag bill. And yet we're going to vote the bill off the floor with some glaring deficiencies. I think it's a tragedy. But back to some of the Carver County younger farmers. How many of you are familiar with the term sidewalk farmer? Sidewalk farmer is something that came out in the 1930s. There was a sidewalk and a suitcase farmer. Sidewalk farmer is somebody who lives in town and goes out to farm the family farm land. And what's happening in Carver County is we're getting more of those people moving into town, getting, as they call them, city jobs, and doing some farming almost as a hobby. And Carver County has a proud heritage of being an amazing farming community. Representative Erdahl is still here on the floor, and Representative Erdahl and I could tell you some stories about one very famous Minnesota farm that many of you have probably read about in history books or have read a book. It's called the Andrew Peterson Farm. Andrew Peterson was Swedish. We won't hold that against him as Norwegians. It's okay, Representative Sundin. But kept a detailed diary that was sent back to the old country, and that book in Sweden is still a big deal till this very day. And the Andrew Peterson Farm is now being refurbished, and the heritage of the Andrew Peterson Farm in Carver County, and indeed in the state of Minnesota, is an important piece of our history. It is an important study in the life of a farmer. And I encourage you to come out to Carver County because, I think I am one of the few members that drives in and out every day because I don't qualify for an apartment, and I wouldn't want one anyway because I like going home and not sleeping there because I don't sleep a lot. But I drive home. And if you want to see one of the most beautiful things you could possibly drive through farming community. If you want to understand why the artist Grant Wood was so popular and so successful, and you want to see it in color because most of his were black and white sketches, come to Carver County. Drive through the farmland there and you'll see the undulating hills of various crops. And in the fall, you'll see folks like Representative Olson here driving very old farming equipment, taking corn or beans off as they work through the night. That makes me very proud to represent them. And some of you want to know why we're here fighting for this. I'm fighting because I also have a heritage of people that occupy this seat for fighting for farmers. So for those of you who have been here for a while, I'm going to read you some names of representatives that will kind of jog your memory. Pat, you'll remember some of these. Chuck Dimmler. He's my constituent now. He lives in Carver County, but he used to live in a different part of Carver County, and he is the author of the very famous Dimmler Amendment. Had a lead foot. That was why we had the amendment. My friend Carol Molnow has held many offices in this state, but this was one of them. Her daughter, constituent of mine. So another one, and I wish Representative McDonald was here. His dad, KJ McDonald. Sorry. KJ McDonald occupied this seat. And lastly, my friend Paul Coles, who many of you served with. Outspoken advocates for farming. And as I began my journey here, Paul and KJ both said, always fight for the farmers. They need you. They need your voice in St. Paul. And I got to tell you, this should come as no surprise. I like a good fight, both in committee and here on the floor. And if one isn't present, I'm not opposed to starting one. But this is a worthy fight. This is a worthy fight. When you have people who have had one of their family members kill themselves out of desperation because of the way things are going on their farm, they need us here. They need us to advocate for them. They need us to advocate for them to have a voice in the process of how we get this bill to the floor, off the floor, and on the desk of the governor. And I will tell you that I've reached out to several of them, and these are people who are in Farm Bureau or farming, and they say, Jim, I just figured you were doing that. And when I can't get a view into the bill, they have a problem. Well, we're here to help solve that problem by re-referring this back to committee. That next generation of Carver County farmers is making a decision right now. They have an inflection point, and many of them are deciding that it's just not worth it. When you can't make money as a dairy farmer, or as Representative Olson said earlier, you make $173, woohoo, big year in the Olson family. That is not dissimilar to what a lot of farmers are telling me every time I meet with them. And you've heard the old adage, well, if you lose money on every transaction, maybe you can make up on it on volume. That's not how it works. It isn't. And so many of my farmers are having a hard time. But here's what I also know. Those century farms, that land, it has a lot of meaning to them. You know, I'd imagine that, Representative Anderson, you feel most comfortable at home driving through your fields. Or Representative Burkle, as you walk out, you know that that's yours. And there's some strength and comfort. Or as Representative Olson, you work on the family farm. There's a sense of meaning there. And you heard me a couple of weeks ago talk about, during the state government finance bill, that was a fine evening, by the way, well, that one of my favorite movies is Field of Dreams. In there, character of Dr. Archibald Moonlight Graham. Sorry, I'm having a hard time coughing. He talked about his hometown of Chisholm, Minnesota, and he said this in the movie: "This is my most special place in all the world, Ray. Once a place touches you like this, the wind never blows so cold again. You feel for it like it was your child." That's how these guys feel, right? You nurture the land because it's yours and you want to pass it on to your kids and on to your grandkids and great-grandkids. This bill has some things that it's helping out on, but it's not enough. It's just not. Think about that quote. Think about what we've heard from the farmers. And I'm not a farmer, but the one thing that I remember as a kid, I listened to President Reagan. I hung on his every word because he was such a fantastic communicator. He said, if you would like to look at somebody who is a bigger gambler than somebody who plays the tables in Las Vegas, look at a farmer. If you want to see somebody who's a bigger gambler than the people who play the tables in Las Vegas, look at a farmer. Right now, they're busting. They are on a precipice of a bad year. Just when commodity prices are coming up, we talked about this a couple weeks ago, commodity prices are coming up, they're all getting excited. What happens? A lack of rain. They will persist. They will keep going. They will find a way, if they can, to make it work. What a gambler. Kudos to you all. But this bill doesn't do enough to recognize the fact that folks like Representative Burkle wakes up at probably a very ridiculous hour. You know, I usually go to bed at about 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning and wake up at about 7 to 8 o'clock in the morning because I'm just a horrible insomniac. So Representative Burkle or others, when you're getting up, that's when my body is giving up and allowing me to fall asleep. That's kind of weird, but it's the truth. You wake up at stupid hours. Same thing with our mining community. They just want to get up in the morning at a ridiculous hour and go dig in the ground and make a living. We need policy that enables that here in St. Paul. We don't have that. And we need a process that says to those people who are looking from the outside in, wondering, as Representative Burkle said and Representative Lewick said earlier, I think, oh, he's not in his chair, they would come down to St. Paul and they would advocate for things. They're the people who ultimately make it in here as a representative, but they're wondering from the outside, what in the world is going on? So they rely on us. They're asking us to provide them a view into the process. And I got to tell you, I don't know what to tell them. You know, you've heard from a lot of us over here that we know some of what's in the bill, but we didn't have a hand in crafting it. The almighty triumvirate did. And if you're willing to bow down and kiss the ring, you might get a little information. That is sad. The transparency of this place should be beyond reproach. The transparency in this place should never be questioned. The ability for any member, whether they're a freshman or one of the most tenured members, should be to be able to give information out to their constituents who want to know about the issue area that they have questions on. Can't do it. When you have farmers who take particular interest in these bills, and Representative Nelson, still gone, is on the conference committee, but eventually recognizes that that's no longer within his grasp, that's a problem. It's a big problem. So you got to realize that that is why we are here fighting. That is why we will stand here and keep pushing. We will stand here as long as we can take in oxygen and nourishment. Representative New Brindley, got it there. Representative New Brindley said earlier, that's why we fight. And so many times yesterday we heard, why are you doing this? Why are you fighting? One member, as Representative New Brindley pointed out, said, what privilege you have to slow this process down. What privilege, I ask, you have to be so opaque in this process. That you take that privilege and you just figure, we're going to put up votes and we're not going to try to get what our people need. I was on the loggia the other night and I was asked, Nash, what are you doing? Why are you fighting so hard? We wish you would just be quiet. That's not a default position that I fall into regularly. And I was offended at the question. Why don't you just go quietly into that good night? For those literature teachers, you'll recognize that reference. Why don't you just shut up, put up a vote, and go home? And you wonder why we stand up and talk. Representative Lucero put on an epic display yesterday. Nice job. You wonder why we're here doing this? You wish we would shut up? Well, I will tell you why we fight. Because we care a lot about the people that we represent, who simply pick up the phone and say, what's going on? And when we can't answer that question, there is a big problem in this place. And you can say, well, that's the process. I don't agree with that. You can say, well, that's just how it is. Then let's not let that happen. Let's not let that persist. Let's stand up and do the right thing. Some of you will say, well, you know, I'm afraid of the fight. I don't like to fight. I'm a peacemaker. Well, you might be in the wrong job. But since we've had so many references to generals and inspirational conversations, I'll give you one from one of my favorite generals. And it's from General George S. Patton. Question was, in the future, when you're sitting around your campfire or your fireside and your grandson asks you what you did in the Great War, and this is of us, you won't have to say, well, I shoveled, I probably shouldn't say that word, in Louisiana. I don't want to shovel manure here. I want to make a difference. And you asking me to be quiet raises my ire. You asking me to sit down and be quiet is going to have the exact opposite. And Representative Sundin, before you leave, the best way for you to make me be quiet is this. And for those of you that have been here when Representative Coles was here, here's how you're going to make me quiet, because I will not go quietly without a fight. This is the only way you're going to get me to do it.
The member from Isanti, Representative Johnson. The member from Monoman, Representative Green.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I rise again today, along with my colleagues, to recommend that this bill go back to committee. The process that's been going on here that we've seen is so wrong. It's just wrong. But in this bill alone, I talked to some of the folks that serve in the committee, and even though they'll tell me that there's some good stuff in the bill, a lot of them never got a say in it. And I wish Representative Sundin was here. I don't intend to call on him, but when I first heard that the chairs of the committee were Representative Sundin and Senator Tory Westrom, I thought, I don't think either one of them are farmers. And I do understand since then that Representative Sundin does have some background in farming, but I think he's probably of the vintage that I am. Vintage is a nice word. I see it all the time when somebody wants to sell something old, but that's where we are. And I grew up in the farming community. We had always had a few cows, never had much land, and so we had different kind of farming and practices that we had. But there was farmers all around us, and that was how we worked. And I can remember, you'd have to be really old and lived on a farm to remember this, but behind the balers, we used to have something called a skid. And it was just 4 big planks, and it hung on a chain behind the baler. And you would stack your bales on that skid, and when you got so high, you had a steel bar, and you'd ram it into the ground and slide those bales off and come back later and pick them up. And those are for the people that didn't have hay racks that they could pull behind the baler. And I can remember baling hay on that skid when I was so small that I could get 3 high. There would be 3 bales on the bottom, 2 on that, and when I'd roll the other one up. And that's how we did it. And you did that, and it wasn't, I mean, you considered it work, but it was just what you did. It's just what you did, and it becomes a part of your life. As I grew older and got to be able to run the tractors, I can remember the first tractor I drove was an old Case, an old Standard. I don't even remember the name of the thing, but if you've been on a farm and you've seen these old tractors, this is the one that had the fenders that went from the front all the way almost down to the ground. And you took that thing down the road, you could not run it in road gear because the front end was like this. And so if you moved the baler or any kind of equipment down the road, you were in 4th gear instead of 5th gear, and even that was risky. And a lot of the things that places that where I grew up, they didn't have a lot of acreage, but they were big farms to us, and very few people had over 500 acres. I remember the first time I heard that somebody had 1,000 acres, 1,000 acres of land. Wow, they must be a big farmer. And I can remember working for one of my neighbors after we got done with ours, and we were baling hay, and he had an old guy working for him. He's probably my age now, but he was an old guy to me, and I think I was about 14, 15 years old, and we grew up a little faster out there, and so the guy who owned the farm was really happy with me because the Saturday before that we were baling hay, and I had a date. And he knew it, but he had to get his hay baled, so I just stayed, and I missed my date. So we keep baling because that's what you did. But this old guy, anyway, we were stacking hay in the hay loft, or not the hay loft, it was a hay barn, pole shed, and the bales were getting up pretty high, and he had me throwing bales to him. Well, 14, 15 years old, you can move a lot of bales, but when you're 60, 65, you can't. And I was pumping those bales on that bale elevator one after another. And pretty soon I heard him screaming at me, and his arms were flashing, waving at me. And he said, "You go up there now." But that was what we did. And looking back, maybe it was a hard life, but it was a darn good life. It really was. It was a good life. And those family farms are so sad to see go. And Representative Nash, you're right. You're right on a lot of things you said as far as, I think only maybe one of the people that I used to work for still has land that they work in my local area. And it's because it becomes so much a part of you that even having to quit, a lot of them ended up devastated because they wouldn't quit when they should have, because it was who they were. I'll talk a little bit about something else later, but just to touch on this, when I was actually born in Bagley, Minnesota. It's probably about 25 miles from where I live now. And my dad logged at that time. My dad was a big guy and a hardworking guy, and I don't even know if there's any loggers in here. Maybe Representative Luke would remember the old log jammers. The log jammers? And the log jammers, my dad made his own. It was an old rear end out of a pickup, and they took one wheel off and they put a spool on it, and then they left the brake on the other side. It had a boom that came up and it would swing sideways, and so you'd drag out your cable and you'd hook it on the logs that you cut, and then you would go hit the brake and it would wheel it in, and it was fixed up so that once it come up, it would roll over, hit the truck, and then you get up there with his pickaxe and move it around, and that's how he loaded the trucks. And I was probably at that time maybe 7, 8 years old, and I used to go out to the woods with my dad, and he would cut a 9-foot stick, and it was a marking stick. And so after he would drop a tree or a few trees, I would come in and I'd hold that stick for him, and he'd cut it off at 9 feet, and that's how he measured it. Now today, of course, it's way different. They've got the big shears, and they just grab whole bunches of them and whack them off and load them. And I remember one time, the jammer quit. And this was a source of income for us. And so my dad, and at that time they weren't buying regular popple, you had to have bolts. And a bolt was something that was 8 to 12 inches at the small end. And the old man, we called him, because it was a term of endearment. When you were the old man, you were the lead. And so the old man loaded his truck by hand with those bolts. And he would pick up those popple logs and toss them on, and then get up there and use the pickaxe. And my dad was a powerful guy, and he didn't get too much lip. So even when we had cows and stuff, and when I got a little bit older, we actually milked 15 cows by hand. And they weren't your regular Holsteins. We had one that looked like a Holstein, except she was blue. We had, and of course her name was Old Blue. And then we had a Guernsey, and we had a Holstein, and then we had some that were crossed, but you milked them all. And we sold what was called bee milk. And so we would just milk them out, and Representative Nelson was right. I used to get on the bus in the morning, and even though you'd shower and scrub, you always smelled like cow. You get on the bus, and somebody would say, "Who stinks?" And it was me, so I just sat there quietly. But when I got a little older, I was never so happy when they quit buying bee milk. They wouldn't buy it anymore if you put it in cream cans. You had to have a bulk tank. So we got to get rid of the milk cows, and I didn't have to milk cows. But the strange thing is, I missed them. I really missed them. And we didn't have a lot of land, so we only ever had about 15 cows tops. That's all we could support. And when the tractor broke down one year, I still remember my dad went out with the pickup and the dump rake, and we pulled the dump rake through and loaded the hay by hand that year, and had stacks of hay. And we had one cow that would crawl through our fence and crawl on top of the haystacks. That was always fun too. But it was just our life. It was just our life. And when I turned 16 and got my driver's license, I got a job working over by Crookston, over in Representative Keel's neighborhood. She would know the farmers if I told them who they were. And these guys had 2,000 acres of land. It was unbelievable to have a farm that big, 2,000 acres of land. And I wasn't driving the combine then, but they were harvesting their grain, and I got to drive their tandem axle truck. It was the biggest truck I'd ever been in. It was 1973. I think it was a Lodestar or Transstar. I think it was Lodestar. International truck. I loved that truck. It'd do 58 miles an hour. And when I was behind the wheel, it went 58 miles an hour. And I remember one time I was dumping off into the elevator in St. Hilaire, Minnesota. And to lift the box on there, you pull out the PTO lever, and then you pull out the other lever that actually holds the fluid into the ram, this hydraulic cylinder that lifts the box. So I dumped the whole thing out, got it into the grain bin, and I shoved in the PTO was already out because the box was out. So I shoved in the other one, and I just took off without looking. Well, the wire was broke, and the box didn't come down, and I took the Highline wires off of the elevator. That was a fun day. There's people screaming at me, "Don't get out of the truck, don't get out of the truck," and sparks were flying everywhere. And the guy that owned the farm was a little upset, but he didn't say too much because that's kind of what they did. They expected things to happen, and they didn't fire me, which was good. But on our little place, and where after we got rid of the milk cows, because we didn't have much land, my dad got into buying bred cows, and he would buy cull cows. And if you don't know what a cull cow is, cows that there's something wrong with them. Either they were a young cow that was bred to a huge bull, or they were an old broken down cow, or somewhere or another those cows were going to have problems. My dad, as big as he was, he could handle that. And so what he used to do is he would buy these cull cows for reasonable, and then he would calf them out, and he would sell the cow-calf pairs, and that's how he made money without having to keep them over winter a lot of the times. And he had one cow one time, it was a little Black Angus, and back before the Black Angus are what they are now, now they're big cows. Back then they were just little short, really, really hardy cows. So if you had a black cow and you wanted to breed it to usually a white bull, you get a black white face, and they were worth more money at the time. And this little cow, she was as wide as she was tall, and that's not a joke. And I remember when she went to have her calf, he went out there, and the hooves came out first, and then you could barely see the nose, and the hooves were like a half-grown calf. And and I won't tell you what he said. He cursed a little bit, and he got some ropes on that calf's legs, and he pulled that cow around the pen twice before he got that calf out. And when that calf had been bred to a Charolais, you know what a Charolais is? And when it stood up, it was half the size of the cow. But you know, that's kind of what we dealt with in my growing up years. But today, it's a lot different. And so when this bill came up, and the folks that were chairing the committee weren't farmers, it worried me. It worried me because as much as I can look back fondly, and probably way more memories than this, the stories that I'm telling you don't fit at all farming today. I know Representative Raleigh talked about cybersecurity. That's a big issue for our farmers today. Back when I was growing up, there was no such thing as cybersecurity that we ever knew of. And your farmers today have to worry about that. And so when you're dealing with a year like this where your crops are dying in front of your eyes, or worse yet, if we came through this last year, I got more calls from beef ranchers than I can tell you. At least one a day. They couldn't sell their beef. And if you've ever listened to a grown man whose voice is shaking and he sounds like he's ready to cry because he doesn't know what he's going to do, it would tell you that the $100,000 extra for the mental health in here isn't enough. It just isn't enough. And I'm going to ask, I was going to ask Representative Nelson a question, but I think Representative Lueck will answer this too, because I think when you were talking about your wolf depredation, that's a huge thing for the farmers. And you mentioned Clearwater County, and I know the people you're talking about, where they don't lose one calf a year, they lose calves a year. And growing up in a family where we did have cows, and I know what it's like to lose a calf. And you have so much money into that cow for a whole year, plus the bull if you've got a bull, or AI if you're going to do that. And then you got that calf on the ground. That calf's only worth so much, and if you lose a calf, you lose more than the calf. And now you've got a cull cow that you lose as well. And so this depredation thing for our ranchers is huge. Representative Lueck, Madam Speaker, would Representative Lueck yield for a question?
He will yield. Representative Green.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Representative Lueck, do you have any idea percentage-wise what you lose if you lose a calf, as far as by the time you feed that cow all year, vet bills, the fact that you have to turn the lights on in the morning to make your farm survive? That is your livelihood. Do you have any idea on that?
The member from Aiken, Representative Lueck.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you for the question, Representative Green. As a matter of fact, yeah, I've got a pretty fair idea from my neighbors and personal experience. And as most of you know, the cattle market, it's kind of like a big sine wave. It goes up and down. So there's times when it's even more painful. But to give you an idea, you know, that baby calf, and doesn't necessarily have to be a baby calf. The wolf will take down a full-grown cow without any big issue, or at least a pack will. On the market, a good 500 weight steer, geez, right now they're something around $1.70 a pound, and that's frankly pretty low right now. So right off the bat, if you lose a baby calf and on a better year, you're talking $800-900, poof. Well, guess what? The cost of keeping that cow 24 months, or a full cycle before you've got another calf marketable, the margin there is about that thin. You know, it's you got to have lots of cows to stay in this business because, and that they say they make fun of some folks because they've only got a few cows because, oh, you're just a hobby farmer. But that margin most of the time is extremely thin. So you don't just lose the cost of keeping that cow. You know, you take that and look at the margin on all your other calves that you produced, and it's got the impact of neutralizing about 20 cows in the herd. They produce zero income for you because you lost one calf, kept one cow for a year, and got no return. And that includes obviously feeding her, wadding her, keeping the lights on. There's a whole bunch of things. Even that cotton picking insurance. So if she gets out on the road and somebody hits her, you at least can take care if there's any personal injury for anybody, or a wrecked car, which, believe me, if your car hit a cow, it's definitely worse than hitting a deer. They're quite a bit bigger. I think probably comparable to a car hitting a moose, which used to be a big problem, but isn't so much anymore because the DNR hasn't sorted out what's happening to our moose. But yeah, it's a huge deal. I'll give you an example of neighbors to the south of me, and bless their heart, I almost went to work managing that ranch. And for a variety of reasons, I decided not to. First of all, I had my own, quite a bit smaller, but and they had this approach that really wasn't working good in our country. But they had a pretty good-sized cow herd. They had about 300 head, and they had a guy that was managed it that wasn't. He knew his cattle front and center. I mean, he was a good cattleman, but he was from Nebraska and didn't have the kind of issues we did. So I know we'd chat with him once in a while. He comes screeching in the yard one day. In fact, actually caught me in a hayfield. And he says, "Man," he said, "I don't know what's going on." He said, "I had the whole herd bust through 2 line fences, just were crazy." And I said, "Well, something obviously scared them." "Yeah," I said, "but there's nothing out there you have to worry about scaring them." So I said, "Well, let's go look." Went and looked, and we didn't go too far, and we found a cow. It was dead down in one of the ditches that through his pasture, and she was pretty bad tore up. And he said, "My God, what happened there?" I said, "Well, He said, the wolves got her. And I mean, they had just got her. They had left, so they'd left the area, and we showed up in the truck. And so I said, well, geez, I said, haven't you been out checking tracks and keeping track? And, well, no. And I said, well, you know, you better bring them cattle in and count them. And he hadn't done. I mean, that's something that, you know, you look and make sure that the cows that are supposed to be out there are out there. That's just something in our country you better, because if they're missing, they could be out causing trouble over to the neighbors on the road, or something's got them, or they're sick. So he brought in the cattle that had been in that area, that 3,000-acre operation. You know how many cows he was missing? 17. 17. And there was no question what happened to him. The federal guys came in, and they spent most of August. They trapped 11 wolves on that farm, and it stopped for 3 years because, you know, in our country, when you slow things down, they just fill right back in again. And that happens to be about 6.5 miles straight south of me. So I pay real attention to what's going on in the Mille Lacs Meadows. Now, they don't have any livestock down there. Right now, they've tried to shift over, and kind of scratch my head. They're trying to grow soybeans and other stuff on ground that was meant for cattle to graze, because every third year it's underwater. And now this year it's bone dry and it's kind of peat ground, so it's just like talcum powder. The wind comes up and it blows all over the place. But that's for another discussion. You know, you learn how to farm in the area you grew up in, and you got to deal with the soil as is. And so, but anyway, so that slowed things down. But boy, right next door, the Saletti family, who I've known for years, nightmare. Westerland family in that same area. They've got livestock that border that area. And, you know, I'm trying to think. My dad was one of the last ones that collected a bounty on a timber wolf in Minnesota, and that was in the late 50s. But guess what? It was down on what's now the Mille Lacs Meadows ground, because at that time it was all tax forfeited. It had been farmed during the Depression, and they couldn't make it. It all went back tax forfeited, so that's where we all went to hunt deer. Instead of a deer coming out, a wolf came out. So, and I think it was $35. But actually, you know, in the late 50s, $35 was more than pocket change. But yeah, we all know we all can figure that math out really quick if you're in the business. And you go backwards, and it doesn't take very much. It's no different than if, you know, you get a frost and all of a sudden you're replanting corn. Man, cost of seed, cost of diesel fuel. You have a problem with the loss of a calf, even though most people don't think, well, it's a little calf and she whiz, can't be worth much. Well, the problem is you hang on to that little rascal till they're worth something and marketable, and they go on to the next step in producing food for people to eat. And that's the other thing is, you know, you get kind of testy about losing animals that you intend for human beings to consume. You know, maybe we're a little bit selfish in the agriculture business about that, but it's like, no. You hang with the deer and the moose and the beaver and everything else you eat. You just leave the cattle alone, because we've got other intentions for them. We're raising them for human consumption, not wolf food, not dog food. So yeah, that, I mean, you're talking, that can cripple you for the whole year. You know, it doesn't matter whether you're big or small. It's a lot harder sometimes to detect those problems when you got a lot more cattle, because that was the issue with my neighbors down there on the Mille Lacs Meadow at that time. Is you know, he just didn't understand. And, you know, every one of us have learned the hard way sometimes. Well, tell you what, he picked up on that real quick because he had to answer to the guy that owned the place as to what happened to those 17 cows and why, you know, why it went on for probably 45 days. But those are the hard lessons you learn. And that's part of you can deal with the weather. You can deal with diseases, weeds, you know, name it, all that kind of stuff. And you have to factor in the issue you have with wild animals. But anyway, well, thank you for the question. Hopefully that provides a little perspective.
Representative Green.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you, Representative Lewick. And the one thing that you did mention, but I just want to make clear, is that when you have a cow and she has a calf, and even especially if the calf is young, when it's taken, most ranchers won't keep that cow because now you're going to feed it for another whole year, and so you lose that cow. It gets sold for slaughter, and slaughter price is never very good. So the depredation thing is huge in here, and we need to make sure that if the state is going to claim responsibility for protecting the wolves, then they need to take the responsibility for depredation. But farmers also have other problems, and pretty big problems. And in my district, and this is one of the reasons I think we need to bring this back, and we need to get farmers into committee and talk about some of these issues. And one of the biggest problems they face in my district, issues they face is the state agencies. And if you want to hear a funny four-letter word, so-called, in my area, actually there's 3 of them now. One is Bowser, one is MPCA, and the other one, they'll have to add another letter to it because it's the DNR. And they just, if you want to make somebody turn red and have the hair stand up on the back of their neck, just mention these guys. And so what is happening in our area is that farmers can't even clean their ditches without permits. The buffer issue has gotten way out of hand. In fact, right now we're dealing with one issue in my area that I think, because we're not able to crack the nut in the environmental committee, and because it has to deal so much with ag, we're going to have to get this into the ag, and that's with our watershed districts, because our watershed districts are completely out of control. And I'll be talking about this later. But our watershed districts are not elected. They're appointed people. They have taxing authority, and they also have something called eminent domain. And I think everybody in this chamber should be familiar with eminent domain and what it really means. And we're dealing with an issue in my area now where we've got about 6 or 7 farmers who are being threatened with eminent domain. And one of them, actually, the situation is there's a swamp. And the swamp was there, and it's to bump the water up should they need it to drain, to hold water until spring flooding is over or a heavy rain is over. And there's a culvert under the road that actually allows that to drain through a waterway. And the farmers want to drain that, and they can't get a permit to drain it because, in this case, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, the other 4-letter word, won't allow them to clean the culvert, public waterway culvert. Instead, what they're telling them that they want to do is they want to use eminent domain across these people's property, dig another public ditch across that property, in which case then they'll get paid for the ditch, but they won't get paid for the buffer, and they won't get paid for the fact that they can't spray 180 feet from that ditch. And this is a huge deal. And to talk a little bit more about the watershed districts, I do know that we have a member here that used to serve on the watershed, and maybe he can clue you in a little more on some of the stuff I'm not aware of. Madam Speaker, will Representative Heinzman yield for a question?
He will yield. Go ahead, Representative Green.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Representative Heinzman, can you fill the body in a little bit on some of the issues that we deal with our watersheds?
The member from Crow Wing, Representative Heinzman.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you, Representative Green, for the question. Before coming to the legislature, I served a local watershed district board. It's an appointed position. all across the state of Minnesota, county commissioners ask residents of the county to serve as a watershed district manager, and I had that opportunity. It was quite an experience, Representative Green, and the motion is to refer this bill to the Ag Committee to look more closely at some of the provisions that have been added, and then also, I think, also to maybe consider looking closely at issues that are impacting agriculture that maybe weren't discussed over the course of session. And this issue with watershed districts is emerging, but it's been ongoing. Not this last year, but just shortly before the pandemic, I was invited to speak to a group of constituents of Mary Franzen, Representative Mary Franzen. And they were very upset. And this ditch issue that you're referencing, Representative Green, is something that can take on a couple of different facets. One is, as you mentioned, the one where you may have a discussion about eminent domain, or you may have a watershed district like these constituents of Representative Franzen. They were concerned because they had a watershed district that was taking out a significant portion of their area and cleaning ditches, of course, at the cost of those affected. And those landowners affected, they don't get to be a part of that process in selecting who does or doesn't get that contract to do that work. And so they were being assessed a huge amount of money in some cases without having any input, really. And watershed district managers, they think they're doing the right thing, but there's really no check and balance. It's an unelected position. You're placed there at the request of your county commissioner, and it's a lot of power. And I'm glad you brought it up because these watershed districts, in many cases, go unchecked. And it can have a huge negative effect. I said a huge expense was being assessed to these particular farmers in the area that I was discussing with Representative Franzen's constituents. And some of the assessments were over 6 figures for ditch maintenance. Chair Sundin, you're nodding your head. I appreciate that. I know you're aware of this problem, and I hope that this bill can go back to your committee. Maybe it's something that we could look at this session. There's still time. I could talk quite a lot about the stories that I heard from some of those farmers, some that were taking out some pretty significant loans to try to cover the costs of those assessments, some that were even considering leaving the family farm because they could not come up with $120, $140, in some cases almost $200,000 to do a ditch maintenance. It was really something that tugs on your heart. And we heard earlier a number of speeches and some debate about young farmers and what they face trying to get into agriculture. And these are things I doubt that you would even consider as you may be looking at the family farm and all of the challenges that you might face trying to get an opportunity to run that farm. Myself, my district, the Brainerd Lakes area, District 10A, Representative Lewick likes to tease me. He says it's the metro side of the district, and that's basically true. I have a few farms in my area, but most of them are in Representative Lewick's. But I still have lots of opportunities to talk to my friends in agriculture. I'm a proud member of Farm Bureau. Glad to hear the concerns of people as they bring them to my office from around the state. And we are, as we've heard today, losing dairy farms at a rapid pace, and lots of other farms around the state, maybe row crop and cattle and so on. the challenge is incredibly, incredibly difficult, and they're not just facing things in weather and so on affecting them today, but as you're suggesting, Representative Green, there's a lot of other factors that this body has authority over. We created watershed districts. I believe it was in the 60s, and watershed districts have, in many cases, served a great purpose. In my own case, the 30 Lakes Watershed District, if somebody wants to look it up, it's gone. Just after I left, the decision was made in Crow Wing County to go ahead and pursue a path to eliminate that watershed district. And you might ask yourself, why? If they're doing good things around the state, why would you do that? Well, I think their decision was wise, and the answer would be it was formed in the 70s, and quite honestly, it was a duplicative layer of government. Since that time, DNR has taken on a lot of responsibility that they previously didn't have. SWCDs have come along. For those of you not familiar with the acronym, Soil and Water Conservation District. Even a lot of county government now takes huge steps to protect land and water that they maybe in decades previous hadn't. So layer after layer after layer, I think it was very wise of my county commissioners to take a second look at their watershed district and consider what is the value there. Watershed districts have levy authority. It can range significantly from one county to another, and this area that is represented by a watershed district. There's tax dollars that are being collected there. That's an obvious impact to a lot of people, depending on the area. It could be quite a line item on your taxes every year. They also have rulemaking authority in many cases. That can have a huge impact and really undermine the responsibility of those who actually have an election certificate, counties, cities, townships. And that watershed district can step in and say, wait a minute, no. We've decided we're going to require fill-in-the-blank septic system upgrades in our area. Who do you go to complain to? The county can just, they're in a tough position. How are they supposed to control those that they've just asked to serve? There's no, like I said, there's no election certificate. There's no opportunity for those in that service area to vote anybody out. We heard earlier about someone, I think one of the speeches today, if we don't do our jobs here, guess what? You might lose your job here. We should take that very seriously. And in cases where you have an unelected bureaucracy, a watershed district, that's acting outside of the values of that area, they might have to make the same decision as was made in Crow Wing County. Since you asked the question, Representative Green, I might actually mention a few things I was going to bring up later on. And I think are important to this discussion. This discussion about young farmers is one that really pricks me. I'm a hobby farmer. I've got Highland cows. In case you haven't seen them, they're big and shaggy. Well, big compared to a dog, I guess. They're about maybe 4 or 5 feet tall. Got the horns. You can barely see their eyes because they're looking through all that hair on their face. My kids love them, and they wander around the woods, and they're fun to watch. So I got, if you count the calves, I've got 9 head. And it's been super fun and good for my family to have the cows running around. And so once we had a few cows, of course, the girls decided they need a few horses. And so that's just kind of grown up on the Heinzman farm. But young farmers face so many challenges. And there's a news story I'm going to quickly reference. something that I think is really super important that we discussed today on the House floor, and I'm going to take the opportunity. So many of you have heard of the Noltes. This story is Duluth News-Tribune. It's dated May 25th, 2021. They recently were successful in the Minnesota Court of Appeals. The court rejected arguments that the Sabika farmer was acting as a front for RD Company. And one of the comments that Tim Nolte made that was quoted in this article was that his family had been dragged through an ordeal. And I know that's just a quote in a newspaper story, but you think about what this family went to, and I've met them now since this whole thing started. They came to the Environment Committee a number of years ago trying to get help. And guess what? No help from the Minnesota legislature. They went through this alone. That process that questioned whether or not they could take possession of, I think, 300 acres and irrigate it was questioned by a number of environmentalist organizations, and signatures were collected. Most of those signatures came from down here, believe it or not. Now, don't get me wrong, I think petitions are great. I think that it's important to be very cautious of what's going into the ground. And I think some of the speeches today earlier were really instructive. You hear about how hard farmers work to protect the ground. That's their livelihood. But in this case, environmentalists targeted this farm, made a number of accusations, but thank God, Minnesota Court of Appeals rejected those arguments. But not without dragging this family through a almost 4-year ordeal. Why is that happening in Minnesota? Tim went on to be quoted as saying, "We don't feel vindicated." He said, "It's been a bad deal for us. There's no celebration inside our house." The judge also rejected arguments that the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources failed to adequately study potential nitrate contamination. So the Minnesota DNR is often drug into these conversations, and years ago before coming to the legislature, I had a lot of preconceived ideas of what the DNR was about. But I've built a lot of great relationships with our friends at the DNR, but technically the DNR is what? They're standing there trying to look at what we write as statute and making decisions that affect folks like the Noltes. And we've done, near as I can tell, nothing to protect farmers from the wrath of an angry environmentalist organization who has a petition and decides to target a farm, accuses them of coordinating with an organization or a farm company that they don't like. And there's little to nothing that this legislature has done. It's not because there hasn't been proposals. There's been a number of them that I'm aware of, but those things haven't gone anywhere. I sure hope this bill could go back to the Ag Committee. And that's something that Chair Sundin, I know you're aware of, and I appreciate this bill. I know you've done a lot of hard work on this bill. It's something that should probably be looked at. I know it's more current news. That ruling was in May, so that probably wasn't something that was maybe on our radar through session over the course of the last few months. But considering what this family went through, and I know there's other families, I did a quick search before I was going to speak on this, and this isn't that unusual. Farmers are facing so many challenges There's a $100,000 increase in this bill to help with mental health. But like Representative Green said, that's probably not enough. And maybe that's not even necessarily the answer. Maybe we need to be doing more to make sure that environmentalist groups can't target agriculture. And this is one way they're doing it, is with a petition and then a court case. You know, and like I mentioned that DNR does a lot of good things. There are some examples, unfortunately, where we've probably made this situation worse. There was a tour, I want to say it's 2 years ago, I was on with the LCCMR, and we went to Wells, Minnesota. Really neat part of the state. I see some clapping over here. And the topography is super, super pretty. And I look across some of the fields. I'm really interested when I look and I see these little circles where trees are growing, and it's kind of an indentation. And they're like, well, that's where the ground has over time, I don't know if you'd say given way, or it's not necessarily a sinkhole, but you just farm around it. It's karst geology, I guess, and the hydrology there is a lot different than it is in my part of the state. The soil's very coarse beneath those fields, and so, you know, the farmers in that part of the state have quite a challenge. Well, on the tour, where all of the LCCMR group was there watching as, I don't know, it's an underground stream, I guess, comes right up out of the rock, and there's a river that flows through the county, I suppose. Stream at that point. I'm sure it enters into a river somewhere along the line. But it was really interesting because part of the discussion that was given, and here again, I'm not trying to impugn the local DNR guy given the presentation, was that those there in the area had witnessed sheets of toilet paper coming right up out of the ground. And everybody's like, wow, that's terrible. Who's doing that? Which, okay, that's a natural feeling, I would think, if you're hearing about pollution entering what could be, at some point, a water supply for somebody, drinking water maybe. And Representative Lucero's not here, but he actually brought up something interesting. He mentioned that he's recently acquired a recreational vehicle, and he's trying to figure out, this will connect, by the way, black water tank and gray water. There you are. Well, I happen to have some experience with a recreational vehicle, and my experience with an RV left me questioning that testimony in Wells, Minnesota. Because guess what? Sheets of toilet paper are water soluble and do not maintain their shape once they hit water. And I know that because I've emptied a black water tank. Sorry, members, that's a little graphic if you think about it too much, but I challenged that testimony later on in an email, and lo and behold, the story was retracted. Representative Heisman, that was hearsay and was not observed or photographed or documented in any way. And my response was, well, then why was that information shared with a group from the legislature as though it was fact? We need to be able to be working from the facts in this legislature, and we're making decisions or hearing testimony. You know, I'd like that information to be something you can count on, and that came from a state agency. I know that's just probably one person, and who knows where their mind was when they mentioned that story that they had heard, which was false. But, you know, those are the kind of challenges that we face here at the legislature. And when we don't go back to committee and get the facts and work through the details on something like a number of the provisions that were dropped into this bill, I'm going to blame the Senate, Chair Sundin, but I think it should be heard here in committee by this body. I can reference one specifically that I actually really like, but I think that it should be heard. I think it's on page 15, 1.9 is the line. Excuse me, 15.9. A project for Central Lakes College in my district. Representative Poston's district also, I think that it affects the Staples campus. You know, these are kind of things that we have an opportunity to take a closer look at, and maybe you'll find out everything is exactly the way it's supposed to be. Great. But what if it's not? What if we inadvertently support a project or a policy that does maybe the exact opposite and hurts our young farmers or hurts a family farm around the state like the Nolte farm? Those are the kind of things that we're talking about here today. It's very serious. It's not a joke at all. You could say, well, the minority is just trying to avoid a conversation, or you could fill in the blank, I guess, with any kind of speculation. But I think the argument's perfectly fair. These are provisions that weren't heard in our committee. It'd be great if we could go back to the Ag Committee and hear this, and a number of other provisions that were added without any kind of opportunity for our members to look at it or for the public to engage, ask questions. And maybe we could even work on some of these issues that are affecting the intersection of agriculture and the environment. Since I have the opportunity, I'm just going to place a question before the body, or maybe not the question, but make the point that in case folks aren't aware, there's a very quiet war between environmentalism, and by quiet I mean it's not something that's on a headline, it's not in the news, but it's right there and you can ask just about any farmer. There's a very quiet war happening, not just in Minnesota, but around the country between activist environmental groups and agriculture. It's right there. And I do not want to contribute to allowing false information. Like I said, I'm not trying to impugn anybody. I'm just saying my own experience was that there have been plenty of examples. I gave you one of state agencies that are sharing, quote unquote, observed science or observed changes in the environment, and not true. In some cases, it's not true. Let's not write policy that hurts farmers without confirming what the facts are. I've served on the LCCMR for a number of years. This is my first term off of the LCCMR, and I want to say, 6 years, something like that. Representative Lewick took my place, so if you have an LCCMR question, and Representative Tice, if you have a question on the LCCMR, I'm no longer there, but when I was at the LCCMR, I've had lots of opportunities, not just to go on tours, but also see presentations brought to the LCCMR. That's the Legislative Citizens Commission on Minnesota Resources. In case you're not familiar with that funding mechanism, that's your lottery money that goes to a trust, the Environment Natural Resource Trust Fund, ENRTF, is where those dollars sit, earn interest, and we spend the interest off of that fund that's been created. In case you ever walk into a gas station and you see the little loon sign, that's your ENRTF at work. Those dollars that you may lose go into the trust. We have almost, I think, $1 billion sitting in that trust right now, which is great for a lot of projects. And the way that funding works, it doesn't appropriate it every other year like we're working on a budget right now. It's actually appropriated every year, about $60 million, depending on how much is, what our return is on the ENRTF. And then that's spent on these projects, which is great. In some cases, though, I wonder. In some cases, I see projects that cause me a little pause. I don't see Representative Hansen on the floor, but there's a lot of conversation over the last few years around soil health and groundwater. Mostly really good conversations. Representative Torkelson isn't available for a question here either, but if he were here, I would have liked to maybe hear from him on a question that he's brought up on numerous occasions. I think he would describe it as historically present nitrogen in soil. I wish there was more research done to try to determine the baseline that we should be looking for in groundwater, in soil, to try to figure out who's responsible, and it very well could be nature in many cases, rather than pointing the bony finger of blame at agriculture and saying, you're to blame. There could be a number of other sources, and I hope that there's somebody out there today who is maybe at the University of Minnesota in a lab somewhere watching the debate today, who would maybe think, let's do a study, let's try to establish that baseline rather than going straight to agriculture and making them the enemy. Every time I turn around, I see agriculture doing absolutely everything they can to improve their practices, reduce waste, constantly working to make sure that they're good stewards of the land. But most of the research I see is pretty negative towards agriculture. And then some of the stories, like I mentioned earlier, that I've heard are also pretty negative towards some of the folks maybe living in Wells, Minnesota. On that same tour that I mentioned, agriculture came up frequently. And most often it was very, very positive, but from time to time it got negative. Let's figure out how to partner with agriculture and support them instead of doing like we see happening to the Nolte farm. Our statute in Minnesota allows a petition to be circulated and signed by people from not even anywhere near that community and trigger a intensive scrutinization of one little farm. That's not fair. How is that right? Even when they win, the quote is, we're not celebrating at the Nolte house. There's no party. I'm guessing it was pretty bittersweet to be found to have done nothing wrong. I mean, they knew their situation the entire time, right? But here they are in court having to defend themselves against environmentalist groups who are accusing them of conducting themselves in some inappropriate way. Our farmers are great people in Minnesota, and we need to support them. Rather than looking for ways to empower environmentalist groups to target them and make an example of them and scare young farmers out of that industry that, let's just be honest, every one of us has a snack in our desk. Every one of us is going to be at dinner tonight at some point, I'm assuming. If there ever was an industry that we depend on, it's our agriculture industry. And they're not treated very nice sometimes. And so, Representative Green, I appreciate the question. We should be doing absolutely everything we can to make sure that agencies around the state, big or small, SWCDs, watershed districts, DNR, MPCA, Bowser, thank you, Representative, are working with farmers and empowering them to do the right thing rather than accusing them, rather than working against them. My goodness, we're dang near in a drought. And there's a huge need for irrigation around the state. If it wasn't for those permits that allow them to access, in many cases, groundwater, imagine where we'd be at right now. So thank you, Representative Green, for the question.
Representative Green.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you, Representative Heinzman. I've got a few more things to talk about as to why this really, I'd like to say must. It just must go back to committee, because there's things that need to be addressed, especially with what we're facing now with the drought and where we're going to have a lack of pasture. We're going to have a lack of hay. And we could do that here. We could set some guidelines for some of our agencies and give our farmers a break on some of this. And I have one more question here. It'll have to deal with some of the newer technology, actually maybe two. But you know, some of the things that Representative Heinzman was saying brought to mind the Nolte farm, for instance. We've been working with the Noltes now for probably a couple years. And what happened with them, in my opinion, should have been criminal. This is a family farm. And that's another point I should make too. You didn't get big farmers overnight. These were the farmers that I talked about earlier. Farmers that I could tell you from my youth that they didn't walk to the barn, they ran to the barn. And they went from one thing to another, and they worked on their own tractors and tried to keep them going. They held up 1950 models trucks for well into the 70s because it's all they could afford, so that they could pass it on to their kids and give their kids a better life. That's what it was. And that's how these people got big. And the reason that you think they're doing so well today is because of the people that came before them that allowed them to take over that family farm and move forward. And we're stripping that away from them. And even if we didn't pass a bill which hurts them, which we do all the time, we're certainly not doing anything to step in and help them. I'm darn tired of it. I'm just tired of it. And I'll address a little bit more on that later, but you know, some of the things that we talked about, you know, like when I was growing up, and how we never heard of cybersecurity. We didn't need it. All we worried about was were we going to get rain? Did I have to tie the cow up to give her a shot because she had mastitis, which I did many times? But today it's different, and the stress that's on the farmers is unbelievable. Representative Olson talked a little bit about the amount of money that goes into farming nowadays, and I learned from being in business, which I will also talk about later if we do get to amendments, is that no matter what your gross is for the year is meaningless. What matters is your net. What matters at the end of the day, did you make any money to put in your pocket that you could feed your kids, that you could buy them clothes for the year? That's what matters. And a lot of our farmers today are in huge debt, because who can afford to go out and buy a $500,000 piece of equipment without going into debt? Very few people. In fact, I don't know that if I even know any. But one of the stressors that they have is now when they sit around the table and they don't talk so much. I'm sure they still talk about, is it going to rain? But they talk about, what are we going to do to protect our assets? What are we going to do to protect people from hacking into our systems? Madam Speaker, Representative Lucero, yield for a question.
He will yield. Representative Green.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Representative Lucero, I listened to you and Representative Raleigh talk about the cyber security stuff, and even though a lot of people still today don't correlate that with the farms and the family farms. You've both made the point that it's huge today. Can you kind of fill us in on some of the aspects where you think that would fit with maybe something we could do as a legislature to help those people out?
The member from Wright, Representative Lucero.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you, Representative Green. That is an excellent question, and I appreciate the explanation that Representative Raleigh gave earlier, and this is an incredibly important topic. In every area of life, every walk of life, every sphere that we are interacting with. And in agriculture, it's absolutely no different. And I will answer that question, Madam Speaker and Representative Green, but before I do that, I want to just talk about something that I heard on the radio many, many years ago. And it's something that captures, I think, the reality, the truth of how important farmers are to each and every one of us. And I'm sure some of you have heard of it. Certainly the farmers in this body have heard of this. So God made a farmer. But there might be some city slickers like myself, I consider myself a city slicker, that perhaps have not heard of this, and I think that we each should. And I heard this on the radio by a man who no longer lives, but he is a great radio personality, or was, Paul Harvey. Paul Harvey. And if you haven't heard it on the radio, I honestly would recommend you Google it, YouTube it. Paul Harvey, So God Made a Farmer. And I have the transcript here that I'm going to briefly read. And I'm going to read this because, again, it captures the value and the importance to every one of us. So we know that the earth was created in 7 days, right? We all know that. We know that from the Book of Truth, otherwise known as the Bible. And it ends on the seventh day, and God rested, right? Well, this transcript then picks up after that, on day 8. And on the 8th day, God looked down on his planned paradise and said, I need a caretaker. So God made a farmer. God said, I need somebody willing to get up before dawn, milk cows, work all day in the fields, milk cows again, eat supper, then go to town and stay past midnight in a meeting of the school board. So God made a farmer. I need somebody with arms strong enough to rustle a calf and yet gentle enough to deliver his own grandchild. Somebody to call hogs, tame cantankerous machinery, come home hungry, have to wait lunch until his wife's done feeding visiting ladies, and then tell the ladies to be sure and come back real soon and mean it. So God made a farmer. God said, I need somebody willing to sit up all night with a newborn colt and watch it die. Then dry his eyes and say, maybe next year. I need somebody who can shape an axe handle from a persimmon sprout, shoe a horse with a hunk of car tire, who can make harness out of haywire, feed sacks and shoes, scraps, who planting time and harvest season will finish his 40-hour week by Tuesday noon, and then paying from a tractor back, put in another 72 hours. So God made a farmer. God had to have somebody willing to ride the ruts at double speed to get the hay in ahead of the rain clouds, and yet stop in midfield and race to help when he sees the first smoke from his his neighbor's place. So God made a farmer. God said, I need somebody strong enough to clear trees, to heave bales, yet gentle enough to tame lambs and wean pigs, and tend the pink-combed pullets, who will stop his mower for an hour to splint the broken leg of a meadow lark. I had to be somebody who'd plow deep, straight, and not cut corners. Somebody to seed, weed, feed, breed, and rake, and disc and plow, and plant and tie, the fleece and strain, the milk and replenish, the self-feeder and finish a hard week's work with a 5-mile drive to church, somebody who would bail the family together with the soft, strong bonds of sharing, who would laugh and then sigh and then reply, with smiling eyes when his son says that he wants to spend his life doing what his dad does. So God made a farmer. Madam Speaker, members, I heard that on the radio, and it is incredibly true. I'm not a farmer, as I mentioned. I don't have any background whatsoever. But as I've heard the stories of those who have come from generations of farmers and livestock, all of those attributes are absolutely true. But it doesn't stop there. It doesn't stop there. We know the first man created, Adam, was placed in the garden to tend it. But there's more. And for those who know Paul Harvey, here's the rest of the story. So Adam, we know, had multiple sons and daughters. The first two were Cain and Abel. Well, Cain was a tiller of the ground. What's a tiller of the ground, members? That's a farmer. Abel was a keeper of sheep. What is that? Livestock, right? Well, then we know of Noah. Now, I don't know what Noah's profession was, but I do know that he had an experience that included an incredible amount of animals. 2 of each kind of animal, but that's not 100% accurate, because it was, if you read the text closely, it was 2 of each unclean animal and 7 of each clean animal, if you read the text more closely. So he had an experience with a lot of animals. In order to do that, right, he had to have the knowledge and the care to take care of these animals. Job. Members, Job had 7,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 she-asses. Job dealt and cared for his livestock. Abraham, members, Abraham, we learn from Scripture that Abraham was very, quote, very rich in cattle. He was so rich, members, that he got to a point that he had to split with his nephew, Lot. And you can see the graciousness of Abraham, much as I read the attributes here of a farmer. He allowed Lot to make the decision. Which way are you going to go? Lot, I will defer to you which way you want to go, and I will go the other way. But see, that is the true sacrifice of farmers. Well, Abraham had a son, Isaac. And it says in Scripture, quote, Isaac sowed and received 100-fold. Isaac sowed the land. He was a farmer. Well, members, Isaac had a son. His name was Jacob. And Scripture tells us that Jacob was, quote, a man of the field. What is a man of the field, members? That's a farmer. That's a farmer. Well, Jacob had how many sons? 12 sons, right? And then 2 adopted sons, so technically 14. Which is why I say, Madam Speaker, the 14 tribes of Israel. But his son Joseph, he fed the flock. Scripture tells us he fed the flock. And if Joseph fed the flock, he has experience with livestock. Just as I heard Representative Burkle and others describe, Representative Lewick. But not only that, members, livestock, Joseph, when he was sold into slavery and went to Egypt, we then learn he spent 7 years storing grain. So he has both halves of the equation, the livestock and then the grain. He has experience. Then we know of Moses. What do we know about Moses? Moses lived 120 years. Now but his life can be divided up into 3 sections of 40. The first 40, he was in Egypt, right? But the next 40, he lived on the backside of the desert. What did he do when he lived in the backside of the desert for that second third of his life, those 40 years? Well, Scripture tells us he kept the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law. Well, if he kept the flock members, what was he doing? Dealing with the livestock. Then we move on, we learn, and by the way, Madam Speaker, members, this is just a few examples. It's obviously not an exhaustive list, but I wanted to demonstrate that there's more to the story than just Adam. Gideon. What do we know about Gideon? Gideon, we learn in the book of Judges. Gideon threshed wheat by the winepress. Well, we have two aspects there. We have wheat, and then we have the winepress. What does a winepress do? It presses grapes. Grapes grow in where? A garden. And then he was at the threshing floor threshing wheat. What is the threshing floor, members, who don't know, who may not know? Now, we have technology today that separates the wheat from the chaff, right? But back then, the way that they did it is that the chaff was lighter in weight than the wheat. And so what you would do is you would crush it, then you would toss it up, and the wind, and so a threshing floor couldn't be just anywhere. They had to be in strategic locations that allowed for the wind. You tossed it up, both the wheat and the chaff, right? They're mixed together. You toss it up, the grain, the wheat would fall because it has a heavier weight, it would fall, whereas the wheat would blow a slight more distance, right? So you'd end up with essentially two piles. And so he had experience with that. How about Samson? We've heard of Samson, right? Samson and Delilah. What did he do? Well, he was a different character, right? Different character. But one of the things we learn is that he fell in love with a Philistine woman. And he went to go marry that Philistine woman, but when he got there, he had found that his would-have-been father-in-law, the father of the would-be bride, had married off the bride to one of Samson's friends. Well, Samson became very upset with that, and so what did he do? He rounded up 300 fox. He then tied their tails together, put a torch in their tails, and let them go in the midst of the fields of the Philistines. In the cornfields, we learn from Scripture. Well, why would Samson do that? Because the cornfields are part of the food chain, the supply chain that sustains life for the Philistines, just as our farmers sustain the life today. You know, members, if I can reach it here, just a few minutes ago, I finished my salad. I satisfied the need. And that salad, I didn't grow a single vegetable that was in here. By the way, salad, no dressing. I don't know, that's a little bit bold. But yeah, for some. But I didn't grow a single thing in here. I am dependent on the farmers that grew this. And so Samson knew that the Philistines were dependent on their fields. And so he burnt their fields. And this is going to get into the security thing because we know, as Representative Rowley had explained earlier, the supply chain is incredibly important for the rest. Well, then how about Boaz? There's a 4-chapter love story in the Old Testament called the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth. And the book of Ruth is an incredible book for those who haven't read it. You have a Jewish grandmother named Naomi, and a famine was occurring in the land. And I'm trying to remember, Amalek, is that his name? Amalek. Amalek was the husband, if I remember correctly. Maybe Representative Hornstein, if he knows offhand. Amalek? Is that how you pronounce it? Amalek, okay. So Amalek and Naomi. See, I'm a Gentile, and I appreciate the correction. And they had to leave, and they went to the land of Moab because there was a famine occurring in the land of Israel at the time. and tragedy occurred. So it was Amalek, Naomi, and their 2 sons, and I can't remember the names of the 2 sons. But tragedy occurred. Well, before that, there was a celebration. The 2 sons got married. They got married to 2 Moabitess women. And so now you had a total of 6 people in the family, right? 2, 4, 6. But then tragedy struck. Amalek died, making Naomi a widow, and then each of the 2 sons died, making the 2 Moabitess women now widows as well. And then Naomi, she heard news that back in the homeland Israel, that the famine was over. And so they were going to move back. And Naomi explained to her 2 daughters-in-law, the Moabitess women, don't come with me. Stay here. I have nothing for you. What are you going to do? Are you going to wait for me to give birth to 2 more sons and raise them so that you can marry them? That obviously doesn't make any sense. But one of the Moabitess women decided to stay, but the other, named Ruth, said, I will come back with you. I will make your people my people. I will make your God my God. And so these 2 women, both widows now, go back to Israel. And I wish I could tell way more detail in the story. And I honestly would. Maybe another time will present itself. And I will, because it's a phenomenal story. But when they go back, and this is why I wish I had more time. I do have more time, Madam Speaker. I know I do, but I honestly am not. I want to keep this short because this is important information. It's a lesson. But there's the law of the Levirate marriage, and then there's the law to redeem the land. That goes into play here, and I'm not going to get into the details of that. But through a series of events, they meet a man named Boaz. Boaz was a kinsman redeemer because she was a kinsman to Naomi. And Naomi, through this series of events, it says in Scripture that she happened upon the fields of Boaz. And I mentioned yesterday, Madam Speaker, that coincidence is not a kosher word. She didn't just happen upon the fields of Boaz, right? But he was there, or she was there. And now the fields of Boaz tells us what? That Boaz was a farmer. And the law of gleaning in the Old Testament, for those who might be familiar, this was the Old Testament way of those who were destitute, the widows, those that didn't have much, is that the landowners were required when they would make a first pass through their fields, and some of the grain would fall to the ground or maybe missed, things like that, they were prohibited from making a second pass. And the widows and others were permitted to go into the fields and then harvest that which was missed. And we know from Scripture that Boaz, it says, Ruth caught the eye of Boaz. What does that mean? Yeah, caught the eye of Boaz. And so what did Boaz do? He instructed his servants, the reapers, at the time of harvest, let some grain fall. Let some grain fall. Let Ruth harvest it. And she did, and she brought it back to Naomi, and Naomi was astonished. She said, whose field were you in? How did you get so much? This is not common to harvest so much. But the point is, Boaz was a gracious and giving farmer. He opened up his heart to help those. Then we get to David. How many know David? How many have heard of the name David? King David, yeah, absolutely. King David, it says he was in Scripture, quote, a keeper of sheep. Well, if he was a keeper of sheep, what does that mean? He's certainly involved with livestock, just as Representative Lewick, just as others have explained. Now, if it says he was young when he was a keeper of sheep, so that means the sheep then belonged to who? His father. Who was King David's father? Pop quiz. Jesse, yes, Jesse. Jesse. And so Jesse, right, obviously was in the industry and taught his son, David. David obviously had brothers. He was the youngest of all of them. But it's not a coincidence, members. Again, coincidence is not a kosher word. Boaz, by the way, Boaz had a son named Obed, and that's probably not how it's actually pronounced in Hebrew, is it? Oh, it is, okay. So Boaz, the same Boaz I mentioned earlier of Boaz and Ruth, had a son named Obed, and Obed had the son named Jesse, and Jesse had David. So you see a long lineage here, a long lineage of farmers and those involved in livestock. And so, members, and I'll stop right there, it goes on, but we can see from Scripture that from the beginning of time, when time started, the farmer was the first profession. And the first profession, the most important, has gone on throughout the thousands of years of human history, sustaining life for all, giving of themselves, making the sacrifices for their families and their communities. And that's what our farmers are doing today. And that's why it is so important, members, that this bill before us, HF 8, is done right. And because we have not had a committee hearing on this bill that I hold in my hands, HF 8, has not had a committee hearing. That's why I'm in favor of the Anderson motion to re-refer back to committee. Because of the importance of our livestock producers and our farmers all across Minnesota and the dependency that we have. Now, Madam Speaker, to the question that Representative Green had asked, which is a very important one, about security. I pulled up this, oh, by the way, so just reading from the bill here on line 7.13, it says, robotic dairy milking equipment, right? So robotic dairy milking equipment. So we're gonna give money in support of that function. So I actually Googled robotic dairy milking, and many articles came up. And I wanna read just a small article here, just a small article on robotic dairy. Humans, and the article is titled, Are Connected Cows a Hacker's Dream? Members, are connected cows a hacker's dream? Humans aren't the only ones consumed with connected devices these days. Cows have joined our ranks. Believe it or not, farmers are increasingly relying on Internet of Things devices. It says IoT and Representative. So I've been passed a note here, Madam Speaker. I'm willing to, if we recess now, we would just pick it up, and I can finish this article, or I can pick up this article when we come back. I'll pick up the article when I come back. So I won't yield the floor at this time. I will allow somebody to interrupt me with a motion. Madam Speaker, as I'm talking here, I'm waiting for the Majority Leader to interrupt me with this motion. You don't want to interrupt me? I can go on then.
The member from Hennepin, the Majority Leader, Representative Winkler.
Madam Speaker, members, I'm going to move a recess to the call of the chair for approximately 2 hours.
Representative Winkler moves for a recess to the call of a chair for approximately 2 hours. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? Aye. The House is in recess. The motion prevails.